Welcome back to our study of the book of Proverbs. This week we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 23, and we are going to be on lesson number 9 in this series. And once again, I'm depending pretty heavily upon our commentary writer here and the work that he's done in this curriculum, so I'm very thankful for that. And Dwayne McCrary is the team leader, and LeBron Matthews is the commentary writer. So thankful for the work that he did. It's made this book a lot more enjoyable for me. It's made it a lot more teachable for me, if you remember some of my hesitations to begin. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through Proverbs 23, and we're going to go from verse 19, and we're going to all the way through the end of the chapter, which is verse 35. And primarily today's lesson is looking at the topic of what happens when we overindulge, and Solomon's warnings against overindulgence. And specifically here, he notes the tendency towards alcohol and the consumption of alcohol to the point that the individual becomes reliant upon the alcohol, and to the point that the individual seeks that out above everything else. And as I was studying this, I was struck by the reality that, yes, Solomon makes direct relationships between alcohol and behavior, but I was really struck by how much this reflects the ways that I have a tendency to become consumed in maybe topical things, maybe things like politics, maybe things like sports, things like consumption of social media and stuff like that are all very much in the same framework in the type of behavior that they induce or deduce from us, or that comes from us in our pursuit of them. And so in chapter 22, Solomon kind of points out the realities of some of the dangers of wealth and the search for wealth. And then in chapter 23 he gets into this topic of alcohol, and I thought it was kind of interesting because I'm raised in the South. I was raised in a church where it was taught no alcohol consumption. Any alcohol consumption was literally considered a sin, and some people even almost considered it a mortal sin, a magnified sin. And of course we're in a little bit of a different time now. We don't see things quite the same way. I personally don't see things quite the same way. Potentially the church I was raised in still does, but I don't. And as I was thinking about this, I was challenged by some realities, though. Maybe you're like me, maybe you're my age or younger, and you've heard how bad the Prohibition era was and how it was so ridiculous, and we shouldn't have gone that route. We shouldn't have ever done anything like that. And I read an interesting study a couple of weeks ago and went looking for it again today and didn't quite find the same article that I had read, but I was able to find some other articles that substantiated what I had originally read. And it was talking about alcohol consumption prior to the Prohibition era, and how legitimately many people put it at almost 3.5 times of the average rate of what is consumed today in America. Now you think about that for just a minute. So the idea would be, if a person consumes, pick a number, 5, 10, let's say 10 alcoholic beverages a week in today's America, and I don't know what the average is, but I'm just giving that as an example, that in the era prior to Prohibition, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, it would have been 3.5 times that much. So you're talking about 30 to 40 alcoholic drinks being consumed by an individual compared to 10 today. I thought it was kind of fascinating because I've kind of always heard, at least from the American perspective, kind of a negative things towards Prohibition and maybe the churches that helped bring that about. And after reading that, you had come to a little bit of an understanding of what they were up against. And I will tell you, quite frankly, that sounds a little bit like something that we're consuming today at an alarming rate. And I'm not talking about our children, I'm talking about us as adults. We are consuming media, cultural media entertainment at an alarming rate. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, you name the networks, they are there to entertain you. They are not there to inform you. They are there to entertain you. And one of the ways you can tell whether or not they're there to entertain you or inform you is whether or not they leave you wanting to come back for more tomorrow. And almost every single talk show, whether it's radio, television, whatever, they are always going to leave you on some sort of cliffhanger, begging you to come back tomorrow. And that rolls over into our consumption of social media, into our use of social media. And as I was reading these verses, I was struck by how much they challenged me in my own consumption of media, and how much they challenged the way that I kind of looked at things and the way I kind of try to consume media. And my goodness, I have to admit that when Solomon gets to verse 33 and talks about how the guy gets up, he's got wounds, he doesn't even know where they came from, and he staggers back out to get a drink. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've done that. I've watched stuff. I've been emotionally taxed. I've been mentally taxed. I have been exhausted. I have been angry. I have been hurt. I have been offended. And I wake up the next morning and I grab my phone, or I grab my computer, or I grab the television remote, and I just plow right back in to everything that I consumed the day before. And it challenged me to realize that I am as much at risk for an addiction to media consumption as I would be for alcoholic consumption, perhaps even more so, just based on my personal inclinations and personality and things like that. So let's read these verses with this in mind. If you struggle with alcohol, or you know someone that struggles with alcohol, then let these verses mean what they mean on their surface. However, if you don't, and you feel like, this is an area where you can just do a check mark and say, I'm good, then maybe let's not be so quick to do that. Maybe let's take some time and listen to these verses and ask ourselves where in our life they are applicable, where they do challenge us, and where they do confront whether or not we're living a life of faith, or whether or not we're living a life that is driven by consumption and more. So, Proverbs chapter 23, beginning in verses 17 through 18. Solomon is writing, once again, he's addressing young men. He says specifically in this passage a couple of times, my son. So here we go. Don't let your heart envy sinners. Instead, always fear the Lord. Verse 18. For then you will have a future, and your hope will not be dashed. As I was reading this, I thought, what is it, that makes our hearts envy sinners? What is it that causes us to envy? What do they have that we want? And I had to come to grips with a couple of things here. A lot of times people have money that we want. It looks like they have more than we do, or at least enough to make themselves happier than we are. So a lot of times we envy people because of their money. I have to confess, sometimes I envy people because of their mouth. And what I mean by that is they seem free to say anything they want. There's no repercussions. They can just go through life just blurting out all sorts of things. But God hasn't called us to live that kind of life. But I have at times envied people because of their mouth. The other thing is sometimes I think we envy people because of their mission. They have goals. They want to have stuff. And maybe you and I, because of our relationship with God, we don't feel as free to, plan for these elaborate spending goals or things like that, self-entertainment or self-satisfaction. And but sometimes we look on people with envy. And the reality of this is that Solomon presents this as a choice. That you and I have a choice on whether or not we will envy the wicked. Because he says, don't let your heart envy the wicked. And the idea there being that the heart is the emotional center of your being, was able to decide whether or not they should envy this. And I thought about that. If you didn't know, this weekend the circus is in town. And it actually looks pretty cool. I'm not going, but I would like to go. And if you may be going, and that's fine if you are, but I have felt like that, given the role that I play here at the church and the responsibilities I have, that to go out in public in a place like that at this point just wouldn't be the wisest thing to do with potential for COVID transmission and things like that. Now, you may be going and you may feel perfectly fine, and if you do, go for it. But I can't do that. But I'd like to go, but I have a choice. You know, I can say I'm not going and get over it and move on with my life and choose and act and do the things that I am able to do and called to do. Or I can sit back and whine and groan and complain and point the finger at other people that are going and mock them or complain about them or whatever it may be. It's a choice. And Solomon says, don't let your heart envy sinners. Instead, always fear the Lord. Now, instead, always act with the knowledge of God's presence. And verse 18, for then you will have a future and your hope will not be dashed. The reality of someone who trusts in the presence of God believes that there is more than meets the eye. I wrote a devotion this past week for our daily devotionals, and I was writing in John chapter 2, where Jesus says, you can tear down this temple and I'll build it back in 3 days. And the Jews were like, that's impossible. It took 46 years to build this temple. You're an idiot. Except for Jesus was speaking about resurrection. And when God speaks and when God acts, resurrection is always possible. And this is the reality of what Solomon is calling us to, that you will have a future, a resurrected future, a new life, a new place, a new heaven, and a new earth. And your hope will not be dashed. The idea here of hope is not, oh, I wish it happens, but of confident faith, of literally getting up and saying, because of what I did yesterday or because of who God is, this will happen. And so that's where our hope is. So we look first of all at this promise. The second thing is this. Solomon makes a clear plea or a petition to his son. He says, listen, my son, and be wise, in verse 19. Keep your mind on the right course. Once again, the reminder there is a way that is good. There is a way that is right. And as we look at this, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to look at alcoholic consumption in just a minute and how Solomon points to the dangers of excessive consumption. And the reality of our lives as we look around us today, and I talked about media consumption, and man, what are we doing to keep our minds on the right course? In difficult times, we can easily turn to vices for comfort. We can easily turn to things that feel good in the moment, that satisfy just me personally. Maybe it's mouthing off at somebody online. Maybe it's sharing something that we know is cruel. Maybe it's laughing at a joke, or maybe it's overconsumption of food or overconsumption of alcohol or something like that. We turn to those things for comfort, but they don't give us comfort. They just feel good in the moment. And Solomon is reminding us that we have a choice to keep our minds on the right course. And I hesitate to even ask, but I would say that probably most of us have been greatly challenged in the last 4 months to keep our minds on the right course, to stay focused on what is important and what is good and what is healthy. Because here's why. For the drunkard and the glutton will become poor, and grogginess will clothe them in rags. And you know, what Solomon is saying is this, is that overconsumption of alcohol and overconsumption of food will literally leave you poor. And it will. It'll leave you without anything. And at the moment it won't feel like it because the moment felt good, so therefore you just kept on consuming. But if you take that and you apply it into other areas of our life, like our media consumption and our entertainment consumption, man, we are poor, are we not? Are we not poor in how we get along with each other? Are we not poor in conflict resolution? Are we not poor in listening to other people? I mean, if all we do is consume, then we're not healthy to put things back out there. We're not healthy to think through processes and come to grips with decisions and different things. So Solomon has a petition that, man, you got to keep your mind on the right course. Do not overconsume. You're going to become a glutton, and it'll leave you penniless. It'll leave you in rags. And so now he paints this horrific picture of this individual, and I'm just going to read it, verses 29 through 35 of this individual. Who has woe and who has sorrow? Who has conflicts and who has complaints? Who has wounds for no reason and who has red eyes? Those who linger over wine and those who go looking for mixed wine. Don't gaze at wine because it is red, because it gleams in the cup and goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake and stings like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things, and you will say absurd things. You'll be like someone sleeping out at sea or lying down on the top of a ship's mast. They struck me, but I feel no pain. They beat me, but I didn't know it. When will I wake up? I'll look for another drink. I mean, this is a rough picture. I know this picture. You possibly know this picture or know somebody who you have seen who is representative of this picture. And it's a sad picture. The challenge for us is not to look outward and say, okay, I know a drunk that needs to read this. The challenge for us is to say, where am I in this picture? What am I doing? What in my life can consume me to the point that I would literally allow myself to be beaten and look and say, I feel no pain. I feel no pain. I'm just going to keep going. And so let's break it down. And Solomon talks about the physical effects of too much consumption of alcohol in verse 29 when he talks about wounds for no reasons. I mean, people run into things, people hurting themselves, not even realizing what was happening, and who has red eyes. I mentioned earlier in the very beginning about how the consumption of alcohol in the frontier and in the Midwest was so heady. It was so prolific that literally there were towns where hardly any productive work was done, and all sorts of people having all sorts of regular mysterious injuries and cuts and bruises and things that they couldn't explain because they were consuming so much alcohol. They didn't physically and mentally were not fully aware of what was happening with their bodies. And so Solomon says, hey, here's the thing. Nothing satiates you more, worse, pain. In other words, more you get, the worse it gets, the more pain you have. And this is what he's saying. He's like, these people think that they're soothing themselves, but they're causing themselves to have wounds that they can't even explain. They're exhausting themselves. And then verse 31 through 32, and this is where it kind of hit me as I was studying this passage, that this is not just applicable to alcohol. He says this, don't gaze at wine because it is red, because it gleams in the cup and goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake and stings like a viper. The way things appear is not as they are. I'm not even going to share the illustration that I had written down, but, well, I'll halfway share it. One of the things that social media has done is given rise to popular speakers, pastors, if you will. Television did it before social media. A newspaper did it before that. Books did it before that. It's not social media's fault, folks. We like having somebody who makes us feel good about how we feel about certain topics. But I know from having read and having witnessed some of those circumstances that some of those people whose faces and names many of you would be very familiar with have done and said and behaved in absolutely horrific and toxic ways. And I mean currently. Like this literally happened in the last year or two. And yet their faces are still all over social media proclaiming quote unquote truth and goodness and all these sorts of things. And the reality of it is things are not always as they appear. Solomon says you look at the wine and in the cup it looks good, it gleams, it's pretty, you think it's going to taste good, but you can't stop yourself. And because you can't stop yourself, you keep consuming it, and then in the end it's biting like a snake and stinging like a viper. Well, I mean, if you have any experience or any knowledge of alcohol at all, you know that he is not speaking of a single cup of wine. He is speaking of the inability that someone has to understand limitations and behavior choices. And so he says, in the end, it's going to destroy you. And here's what he says. And this is where it started to really hit home. Your eyes will see strange things, and you will say absurd things. You know, we are children of God. We are called to love as Jesus loved. We are called to give as Jesus gave. And if we choose to behave in a way that is contrary to Jesus, it is because we have looked on something that looks better to us than Jesus, and we have chosen to overly indulge ourselves in that. He says, you'll be like someone sleeping out at sea or lying down on top of a ship's mast. And the reality of this is that our lives are going to literally be thrown around as we become consumed in this consumption cycle. More. It looks good, give it to me. It looks better, give it to me. It allows me to feel my anger and show my anger and frustration, give it to me. And he says this, they struck me but I feel no pain. They beat me but I didn't know it. When will I wake up? And then probably to me the saddest phrase in the book of Proverbs is this, I'll look for another drink. Friends, we are called to be wise. We're called to live in the knowledge of God's daily presence. And in order to do so, it means the rejection of a lot of things that may appear in a moment to make us feel better. Don't be caught looking at a glass and thinking that'll be fulfilling. Don't be caught looking at a screen and thinking that'll be fulfilling. Be caught placing your faith and trust in the God who redeems and in the God who can bring about resurrection. God bless you.